squatting Slav TV.
As you're probably aware by now, anti-government protests and rallies have been taking place in cities and towns all across Iran. According to the mainstream media, the demonstration started last Thursday as tens of thousands of people took to the streets to protest Iranian President Hassan Rouhani's failure to revive Iran's struggling economy, high unemployment rates, inflation, and corruption. Thus far, there are reports that 21 people have been killed and that dozens have been injured in clashes with local authorities. Oddly enough, these demonstrations, which were initially addressing the economic situation in Iran, quickly turned into protests demanding for regime change, raising the question of whether or not these protests were in fact a color revolution. For those of you that are unfamiliar with the term, a color revolution is essentially a regime change which mimics a real revolution by mobilizing huge segments of the population, with the end goal being the replacement or changing of a political leader or government instead of an entire social structure. Historically, most color revolutions have been carried out in order to install pro-American puppet governments and their foreign and economic policies. While some of the images emerging from Iran are shocking, Iran and most of the Middle East are definitely no strangers to these now obviously repetitive color revolutions that have been taking place for years, all the while encouraging various Arab Springs and regime changes. Rewind time back to 2014 and you would have seen the Obama administration supporting the rebels in the violent Euromaidan anti-government protests in Kiev, Ukraine, much like they supported the so-called anti-Assad moderate ISIS rebels during the 2011 protests in Dara, Syria, which ended up escalating the country into a 7-year war. While the alleged demands of the Iranian protesters seem reasonable and legitimate enough, the mainstream media has up until this point been reporting that the primary concerns of the demonstrators center around economic concerns. According to some reports, female protesters had gone so far as to shout "Death to Khamenei" and had shed their hijabs in order to construct makeshift flags, while others say that the protesters were focused on government corruption. However, as the third day of protests took place, the Western mainstream media began reporting that the protesters were demanding an end to religious dictatorship and the policies of both the Ayatollah Khamenei and President Rouhani. While there are numerous unanswered questions about these protests, the first question is, are they truly organic Iranian protests? Iran is most certainly a religious dictatorship, and many Iranians want freedom from religious rule. However, it should be remembered that the United States and Israel have openly stated a desire to see Iranian influence broken as recently as 2009, when the United States attempted to engineer a color revolution in the country. The first 3 days of the infamous Green Movement color revolution of 2009, which centered around allegations of electoral fraud in Iran, looked very much like the first 3 days of this current movement. Clearly, economic concerns are a major issue in Iran, a country whose economy has been suffering for years under Western sanctions and its own inability to capitalize on a state-owned national bank. Despite lifting some of the sanctions, there is hardly any economic growth in the country as a result of neoliberal economic and trade policies. It is also worth noting that Khamenei has also been critical of the poor economy and the handling of economic issues by the government, yet Khamenei is being insulted at the protests. Iran recently liberalized its laws regarding women's forced head coverings, so why protest now over religious laws? In addition, special attention must be paid to the concept of protesting government corruption, a hallmark of color revolutions, since government corruption is more of a conceptual issue than anything concrete. All in all, whenever there is room to spawn regime change in the Middle East in times of political turmoil, you can bet that the US neocons, the mainstream media, and their partners in Israel will be there to facilitate the process. Throw in some paid government protesters, paint a sovereign government as a boogeyman, cite mass anti-democratic human rights violations, have the media demonize the government, and voila, pretty soon you've got yourself some good old violent regime change hitting the fan. For instance, when Saddam Hussein was labeled a violent dictator who ripped babies out of incubators while hoarding hidden WMDs, he was swiftly removed in Iraq. Muammar Gaddafi was violently killed by neocon-backed ISIS rebels in Libya for wanting to stray away from the petrodollar, and I think it's safe to assume that Assad certainly would have met the same fate in Syria had Hillary Clinton come into power with her track record of peaceful humanitarian intervention across the Middle East. The wars that followed the toppling of these regimes in the Middle East, in countries such as Afghanistan, Iraq, Libya, and Syria, were fought primarily out of Israel's interests and resulted in hundreds of thousands of civilian and military deaths, all the while costing the US billions of dollars. Donald Trump, who I originally supported for campaigning on an anti-war platform, was also quick to tweet about how the world should stand with the people protesting in Iran. This was quite odd, considering that Trump is one president who definitely saw his fair share of protests against him in the course of the last year. Many other neocons echoed these same sentiments, and President Netanyahu of Israel also unsurprisingly applauded the brave protesters in Iran because any kind of instability in the Middle East obviously directly benefits Israel's interests and those of their shill politicians in the US. Israel, which has always relied on maintaining active conflicts close to its own borders, has been heavily involved in egging on the conflict in Iran because Iran is one of the last standing theocratic Islamic powers left in that region. Basically, a destabilized and fragmented Iran is every Israeli politician and neocon's wet dream because it simply ensures American foreign policy in the region and the establishment of the central banking system. Iran, much like Libya and North Korea, is not a member country of the central banking system, so this may in fact be the reason why we've seen so much negative commentary aimed at Iran and North Korea in recent times from the international community and the UN. As the situation in Iran continues to unfold, it will be interesting to see how the Iranian government handles the chaos caused by what is more than likely a color revolution. Iran's Middle Eastern neighbors, which are currently in shambles from ongoing destabilization and fragmentation, are testament to the bloody path that Iran itself may take if foreign influence gets involved in deciding the fate of a country whose politicians realistically have a lot less influence on us than the politicians of another country in that very same region.